Greetings, sisters and brothers. Greetings, comrades. Welcome to African History Club. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. This is episode number 9. Today we will be looking at the kingdoms of Nubia and the kingdom of Axum, sometimes spelled A-K-S-U-M, sometimes spelled A-X-U-M. I welcome all the members. I welcome all members that have just joined in the last week. And I hope you had a time to go through the previous podcasts and caught up with the rest of us. We've been looking at the history of Africa from antiquity, from origination of humankind, to better understand contemporary Africa and the challenges faced by contemporary Africa, especially the challenges imposed from outside Africa. So what we've been able to accomplish so far in the last few weeks is to demonstrate that nation states, cultures, communities, kingdoms, and empires had been formed in Africa from antiquity. So this in of itself explodes that laughable myth that when Europeans invaded and colonized Africa, their mission was to bring civilization and government. This cannot be true because, as we know, many of the European nations did not exist when Africa was already creating many of these sophisticated states. England, for example, did not really exist until the 10th century. Germany, Italy, these are newly created nations in the latter part of the 19th century. So that nonsense we can easily take off the table very quickly. The allegation that Europeans came to civilize Africa and to create government and to teach them how to create nation states. What we've also been able to establish is that sophisticated trade routes and trading patterns existed in Africa from antiquity. We've just looked at Egypt, Kemet in the last episode, and we saw the complex trading network that existed at that time. And today we will do the same thing and learn the same thing when we examine the kingdom of Nubia. But we also looked at the Western Sudan and the complex trading patterns that were established and created in what is now West Africa, including the Trans-Saharan trade route. And on the East African coast, we looked at the city-states and the trade patterns with the Arabian Peninsula, as well as the Far East. And we saw the empire of Great Zimbabwe and Monomatapa from inland Africa and the trade patterns leading to the Indian Ocean coast and to the rest of the Far East. And of course, this was one of the things that was disrupted with European colonization. The trading patterns that had been, at least on terms that Africans believed were favorable to them, were hijacked and patterned to benefit the European empires. Another thing that was disrupted was labor and the labor force in Africa during the era of enslavement. And that will be the subject of our next podcast, episode number 10. And then finally, resource plunder. We've established that it started as early as the 15th and 16th century during Portuguese plunder of the East African city-states. So now today, let's examine the kingdom of Nubia. We cannot really understand Nubia in isolation of Egypt, Kemet. And I keep referring to Egypt, Kemet, because they did not refer to themselves as Egypt or Egyptians. That was a Greek word. They referred to themselves as Kemet, and that goes back to the African origination of that culture. And the empire of Nubia was referred to as Kush by the people of Egypt, Kemet. And they shared a lot in common in terms of their culture, in terms of their artistic and creativity, and in terms of their scientific inquiry. And the location of Nubia to the south of Egypt, Kemet, to me also once again affirms Professor the late Cheikh Anta Diop's argument that Egypt, Kemet, was an African origination and an African culture. Of course, to the north of Egypt, Kemet, we have the Mediterranean world. And yes, there was interaction at a later stage between Egypt, Kemet, and the Mediterranean world. But if you look at what was south of Nubia, was the rest of internal Africa, going back toward the Great Lakes region, which is where mankind originated. So if Nubia was able to create a culture that is similar in many respects to that of Egypt, Kemet, without having a Mediterranean region to its south, then to me, that is yet further demonstration that both Egypt, Kemet, and Nubia were, of course, African cultures. Nubia thrived as an agricultural community, and as the surplus increased, kept expanding, and the culture became more sophisticated. They shared many things in common with Egypt, Kemet. The people of Nubia worshipped some of the gods of Egypt, Kemet, and the people of Egypt, Kemet also worshipped some of the gods of Nubia. The Nubian Empire also, at one point, was actually able to conquer and dominate and rule Egypt, Kemet. King Shabaka established what became the 25th dynasty in 731 BC. But on many occasions, Egypt, Kemet was either in control or directly ruled Nubia. For example, from 2000 BC, and then later between 1750 BC to 750 BC. So that was the type of relationship that existed between Nubia and Egypt, Kemet as neighbors. They had very strong trading relations. Nubia also traded with the Red Sea region and traded with the Mediterranean world, and also traded with the Far East by having long caravans that traveled to the Red Sea region and toward the Indian Ocean. Nubia became renowned for its gold production because it controlled the source of gold in the region. So gold was one of its exports. Ivory was another one of its exports. Incense was another one of the exports. And food was also one of the exports. Nubia also became renowned for its iron production and iron works. By 500 BC, it had become one of the major producers of iron due to its proximity to major iron ore regions in Meroe. And if you go to Meroe today, in the 21st century, Meroe is about 100 miles north of Khartoum, which is the capital of modern Sudan. You'll still see heaps of iron slags, industrial waste, and it shows you the magnitude of the iron production and iron works of the kingdom of Nubia. Nubia was also famous for its very distinct painted pottery, which was one of its exports as well. When did Nubia start to decline? The numerous wars with Egypt, Kemet, and then the defeat by the Assyrians that actually drove Shabaka out of Egypt, Kemet, signal the beginning of its decline. The decline was accelerated in the 4th century when Nubia was invaded by the kingdom of Axum, and Meroe was destroyed. But Nubia continued to exist. It was defeated again in the 12th century by the great general Saladin from Egypt, Kemet. On that occasion, Nubia had sided with Christian Europe during the wars of the Crusades. And then it was in the 17th century that Nubia was once again defeated by the Islamic invasion, and Islam became a dominant religion in Nubia. Prior to that, Christianity had thrived in Nubia. So while they'd been worshiping their own gods and some of the gods of Egypt, Kemet, in the 6th century, when Egypt, Kemet, the 6th century was controlled by the Byzantine Empire. The Emperor Justinian imposed Christianity in Nubia. So that thrived, and the relics are there. There are paintings that depict 25 Nubian bishops that were unearthed so many years ago. So when the Islamic religion became dominant in the 17th century in Nubia, some of the Nubians actually moved further south, and they moved to the region which is now called the Nubia Mountains. And the Nubia Mountains are located in what are the modern states of Sudan and South Sudan. These Nubia actually never adopted the Islamic religion. So they maintain their culture and traditions from antiquity. They dress in minimal attire, and in some cases, in no attire. They are renowned for their body paintings. They are renowned for their dances, which bear resemblance with some of the dances that were depicted on the inside of temples and the pyramids of ancient Egypt, Kemet. And they're also renowned for their wrestling. They have a tradition of wrestling that also dates to antiquity. There's a very interesting book that documents this. It's called The Last of the Nubia. It was written by a German filmmaker. Her name was Leni Riefenstahl. And I will give you the name of the spelling in case somebody wants to look up this book, The Last of the Nubia. Riefenstahl. And her first name was spelled Leni. She was actually reputedly a Nazi sympathizer as well. She made a film called Olympia about the 1936 Berlin Olympics. So that is the empire of Nubia, referred to as Kush by the people of Egypt, Kemet. They also had their elaborate temples, their elaborate pyramids that are not as spectacular as the ones of Egypt, Kemet, but the remains are still there today, not as well known as the pyramids of Egypt, Kemet, but they can certainly be viewed if visitors were to go to Meroe. They were also renowned for their unique alphabet, which the late Professor Cheikh Anta Diop says was actually more sophisticated than the hieroglyphics of Egypt, Kemet, which he believed was also passed on from the kingdom of Nubia. So now let's take a look at the empire of Axum, which adopted Christianity in the first millennium, and it would be located in what is now the northern part of modern Ethiopia and parts of Eritrea. It was renowned for its stone buildings and also renowned for building long pillar-like structures that have been referred to as obelisk in honor of the kings. The kingdom of Axum also had its own script, which was called Ge'ez, Ge'ez, which is also a language that still survives today in the 21st century. The kingdom of Axum also minted its own coins, which was, of course, unique at that early time. It was renowned for trade. It traded with Nubia. It traded with Egypt, Kemet, traded with the Mediterranean region, and traded with the Far East. It was also known for its very accommodating policies. The Christian emperor provided shelter to Muslims who fled after they were being persecuted after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And they sought sanctuary in Axum, and the Christian king provided sanctuary. And this is, of course, uniquely interesting because it shows many of the possibilities if this kind of relationship could be forged as early as the 7th century. There's no reason why some of these principles cannot be applied to meet some of the contemporary challenges that we face in the 21st century. The kingdom of Axum started to decline when weather patterns affected the rain and affected the agricultural production. So as the surplus decreased, people started moving away from the area of the Axumite Empire and moved toward the highlands. And it was from the highlands that what we now later knew as the Kingdom of Ethiopia evolved from the Axumite Empire. And the Ethiopian Empire lasted until 1974-75 with the overthrow of the last emperor, Haile Selassie II, by the military in Ethiopia. So this brings us to the close of our survey of the last African empires, kingdoms. In the next episode, we will now focus on the regime of enslavement. But this does not mean that we will not revisit some of the African empires in future podcasts. There's some that are very interesting and worth examining, such as the Kingdom of Congo, for example, and its early engagement with Portuguese imperialism, way before the era of 19th century European general imperialism in Africa. So we will still look at some of these kingdoms in future podcasts. Once again, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the new members in particular. And for this episode's, my reference that I recommend, African Origins of Civilization by Cheikh Anta Diop. And Anta Diop is A-N-T-A. Diop is spelled D-I-O-P. Africa in History by Basil Davidson. Davidson is, of course, D-A-V-I-D-S-O-N. The Groundings with My Brothers by Walter Rodney. Rodney, of course, is R-O-D-N-E-Y. A General History of Africa, Volume number 2. Ancient African Civilizations, edited by G. Mokhtar. And Mokhtar is spelled M-O-K-H-T-A-R. Once again, I thank all of you, and I look forward to continuing our survey of Africa's past in next week's podcast. Thank you.